Okay, I started recording. Can't wait to hear your chidushim.
Me too. I gotta mix them up now. Okay. So we're gonna delve into a couple of concepts that I think are necessary in understanding the new Gemara that we're starting this week, which is Sanhedrin. We're almost finished with Baba Basra. So I wanted to look at a couple of things. I wanted to talk about this the concept of judges and where where in the Torah we find it. And after judges, I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of rov, because although rov appears in many Gemaras, we had it many times in Bava Basra, but the actual notion is a concept that is obviously from the Torah, and it's written specifically regarding judges. So I figured we'd touch on that a little bit also. So when you look in the Torah for the sources of Sanhedrin and judges, so the first thing one thinks about is the psukim, the beginning of Shoftim. Now, true, the main parshios that talk about judges are Mishpatim and Shoftim, but we do have an episode in Parshas Yisro that we're not going to talk about now. We'll save it maybe for a couple of weeks because it appears in the first chapter of Sanhedrin. So maybe we'll talk about Yisro and that whole discussion, and vis-a-vis before Matan Torah, after Matan Torah, and all the wonderful discussions we could talk about Yisro. But I wanted to focus on the first few psukim of Parsha Shoftim. So the Parsha opens up by saying, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lacha
Wait,
b'chol
what
sha'arecha.
about El Medad? That whole passage.
Yeah, okay.
What do you mean? There's 70 and El Medad. They picked the
Yeah,
lots. What do you mean?
right. Okay,
Yeah.
that's also in the first. That's also one of the sources. The Gemara we're going to see in the first chapter of how you need 70 comes from that Gemara also. So I got to save some stuff, right? Or maybe not. But okay, we'll have short attention spans, so let's try to fit everything in. So we'll leave Parshas Naso, Parshas Bahaloscha out for now, and let's focus on Mishpatim and Shoftim. So Shoftim begins with Shoftim v'Shoftim ten lacha b'chol sherecha Hashem Hashem lekecha nosen lacha l'shvatecha v'shavtua sa'am mishpat tzedek. Okay, so right off the bat, we have this mitzvah we're going to see soon of appointing Shoftim and Shotrim. Okay, we were all familiar with Shoftim, but why do you need Shotrim for? So, famous Rashi, he says, Shotrim actually enforce the laws. They beat you up to make sure that you keep the laws, and the Shoftim just judge when you have a case. The second pasuk talks about the prohibition, which is lo sata mishpat v'lo sakir panim, lo tikach shochad ki hashochad yever eni chachamim, v'salef divrei tzadikim. Okay, so basically, this is a prohibition against the judges not to show favoritism, okay, bribes, and it talks about the evils of bribe taking, okay, which is also repeated in Parshas Mishpatim. So here's the pasuk I want to focus on. Tzedek tzedek tirdof, l'man ticheh v'yarashta ha'aretz Hashem Elokecha nosen lach. Okay, so now the pasuk stresses that now that we have this concept of shoftim and shotrim, and to set up a judicial system, what is the goal of all of it? So the answer is, well, because you need some kind of law of the land, right? What good is having all of this if we don't end up with some kind of justice? So this is what you would call a goal-oriented mitzvah. Okay, so tzedek tirdof, Leman tichye, again, read it. These are psukim that we read all the time, but if you just stop and look at the word, you're like, wow. The Torah tells you you should pursue justice. Why? Leman tichye v'yarashtes haaretz, so that you can tichye. Literally means to live, and you should inherit the land that God gives you. So, are you telling me that if not, you won't live? So, right off the bat, Rashi says, okay, Leman tichye v'yarashta, kedai hu mine hadayanim haksherin lahachios es Yisrael ulahoshivan el admasan. The appointment of judges that are ksherim, okay, that are honest and kosher, is enough kedaihu lahachios es Yisrael, to keep the Jews alive, or to keep Yisrael alive, and to bring them back ulahoshivan alad masan, and have them live securely in the land. Now we know Rashi obviously gets 95% of his material from Medrash, a selected Midrashim, and here this is actually a Sifri. But you see that there's a connection, and as we learn Sanhedrin, you're going to see all of the various, if you haven't learned it yet, you're going to see all of the details that we go into just by picking the judges and selecting them and figuring out how the whole operation works. And this one Rashi is very important to keep in mind, because the goal is that we all live. And that's what the pasuk says, that appointment of honest judges keeps the Jewish people alive. It doesn't say that about a lot. It doesn't say about keeping kosher and going to the mikveh and not wearing shatnez. All of our various laws that we have don't connect. It connects it to other things, right? Some have arichas yamim, some have other things attached to it, but keeping us alive is a pretty big thing. So you see, right off the bat that that there's something to be said about this whole operation. Now the Gemara, actually, I'm going to skip ahead to Sanhedrin, to Daf Lamed Beis, because the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis says the following: Tanya, tzedek tirdof, echad ledin, ve'echad lepshara. So the Gemara wants to know, we just read a pasuk, tzedek tirdof. So the question is, why do I have the word tzedek twice? So various answers. The one answer that the Gemara I want to focus on says, well, one is obvious, to tell you that you have to have tzedek when it comes to a conventional din. And the second is where you have to have tzedek when it comes to something called, and we're going to spend time on this in the very, very beginning of Sanhedrin, is called pshara. Pshara is what we all know as compromise, or as what they call in today's day and age, a settlement. Kedetanya, tzedek tirdof, echad ledin ve'echad lepshara, ketzad. The Gemara is going to give us an example of how sometimes you employ din, and sometimes when you throw your hands up, okay, when you can't decide, so we employ pshara. Okay, here's a classic case. Shtei sfinos overos banahar. If you're following at home, I am in Sanhedrin 32b, about 10 lines from the top. So we have a case. Shtei sfinos overos banahar. Upagu zeh bezeh. So we have what we call a Mexican standoff. We have two boats that meet each other in the river. Im ovros shtehen tovos bezeh achar zeh shtehen ovros. So if you could imagine, like today, you have like the Suez Canal, right? Remember when that ship ran aground a couple of years ago and it blocked, right? And no one could go in the canal for like 2 weeks, and it caused like craziness in the world. So here you have a case where you have two boats that are lining up, okay? And if they squeeze together, they both can't go. They're going to drown, okay? If they go one after another, then they'll make it. So that's obvious. Or or if you have two camels that are going up a very narrow path, like in Beit Choron, for all you people who remember Beit Choron in Rosh Hashanah, this is where it talks about, I think this is a reference to Kibnei Maron, right? Where it talks about how we're judged, right? Kivakaras Roa Edro, how you count the sheep. So the sheep could only go one by one. So that's how it talks about also. It uses the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah talks about Beit Choron also. So anyway, so getting back to the camels. So the camels, upagu zeh bazeh, im alu shnehem noflin. If they go together, if they try to climb the same pathway together, they'll both fall. B'zeh achar zeh shnehen olin. So if they go one after another, then they could reach their destination. So it's two ships have to reach their destination, and two camels have to reach their have to reach their destination. But the question is, which one goes first, right? Here we have a tie. They come at the same time, and there's no video replay, so you don't know which came first. So there's no way to prove who came first, and there's also no way for them to go together. So therefore, we have to use a little bit of seichel, as we say. Haketzad te'una v'she'eno tuna. So you have to examine the situation, and this is exactly where we would use something like a pshara. That's what the Gemara wants to say. So what's a pshara? Te'una v'she'eno tuna. Well, let's look at the boats, for example. One is filled with containers up to the sky. V'she'eno tuna, one has no containers on it. So obviously one has cargo that has to get to its destination, and one, it seems like, could wait a little bit longer because there's nothing pressing. It's not carrying any cargo. So the Gemara says, Tidcha she'eno tuna b'pnei te'una. Right? Therefore, the one that has no cargo on it should wait and be pushed off in favor of the one that, in fact, does have the cargo. Okay, so that's one possibility. The second possibility is krova v'she'eno krova, titche krova b'nei she'eno krova. If one is closer to its destination, or if one is closer to where it's supposed to be, so they say, okay, because you came here first, or because you have to get there first, so you win. Okay? How about hayu shtehen krovos, shtehen rachokos? What if they're exactly the same? They have the same distance that they have to get to, and they have the same amount of cargo. So you literally have no idea what to do. So hatel pshara beinehen, you compromise. Umalos schar zelazeh. They each reach some kind of financial arrangement, right? Rashi explains that that when they get to the shore, they figure out who's going to pay who more, and that person is willing. It's like a payoff almost, right? One person, again, they have equal cargo, they have equal everything, but one of them, if one of them is willing to actually pay up to go first, so who's ever willing to pay up to go first goes first and then pays the other guy back. That's what we would call today a compromise or a settlement, meaning you have two people fighting. One of them realizes he's not going to get what he wants, right? So they say, okay, here's what I'll do, and I'm willing to settle. So this is your classic Talmudic settlement, where you have one boat paying the other boat a little bit of, a few bucks to go first. That's how they reach a settlement. And it's interesting because if you go to the Mefarshim on this pasuk, let me open it up. The Hemek Davar, the Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, has a explanation on this, and he says that this is not just a nice thing to do. He says this is Elamishum. I'm reading from the Netziv. Elamishum delo mishkachas asarzu el b'makom shekofin lasos pesher. This is you must compromise. There's no other choice, or else they're both going to stand there forever and no one's going to be able to pass. So there has to be a compromise, almost like if Besdin was there in the water, they would make them compromise and settle on something. And if you can't figure out a judgment, listen, not all the, sometimes you have fights and there's no way someone's going to prove his case more than the other person. So if you can never, ever come to a conclusion, then Bezdin has to make some kind of compromise. That's why it says haketzad, meaning this is an example where you actually have to make some kind of pshara. We have no way of forcing, right, that person who doesn't have the cargo, right, that he should just wait there. So what are the two options? If they really don't want to move, then they get into a fight, a physical fight, right? And one guy shoots the other guy, and that's the way he's going to pass. Or eventually they're going to run out of gas and they're both going to sink. But that's not considered a just ruling. So therefore, because you literally have no way of solving it, and if you remember in Cheskas Sabatim, I think on Lamed Aleph, we spoke about this concept of Kol De'elim Gvar. Remember the case? Zeu Mer Shalavosai, V'Zer Mer Shalavosai. You have two people, right? This one says my father's field. This one says my father's field. This one says my grandfather. Right? They each have a same claim. Or if you have a boat, right, that they're fighting about. Here, we talk about boats again, right? Right. If we have, remember Hahu Arba, right? The boat that was in the middle of the ocean, and they each claimed it. So the Gemara over there talks about Kol De'elim Gvar, whoever physically, and it's Machlokes, Rashi, and Tosfos. I'm sorry, the Rashbam and the Tosfos over there, if you remember what it means, is it physical? But there are a couple of opinions that say that it comes down to a physical fight. Whoever is stronger, or according to Tosfos, whoever has better proofs, but according to one opinion, whoever is literally stronger, he will win. So that's also, and he also ends off, and then Tziv ends off by saying, and he says, he quotes Rabbi, he says, Amor Chazal, Perka Poam, Shechar Beis HaMikdash al Shehemidu Divrei Al Divrei Torah, Perish Loratzu Levater Al Hadin, Afagav Shehechrer Chayil Asos Pesher. We had this concept about a year ago, so when I was talking about the three Rav Yochanans in Shas, that gave three different reasons why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So one of the Rav Yochanans in Bava Metzia says, because al shehemidu divreihan al divrei Torah. They were so strict to the letter of the law. They were so, they were so yucky. They didn't want to move right or left. So they never, ever thought, oh, how about we come to some kind of settlement, right? Lo ratzu levater al hadin. They're not going to give up. And they're going to say, we have to figure out the proper way. There's no compromise. There's no settling. There's nothing. And that was actually one of the reasons for the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. Not to get into it now, but it just goes to show you how sometimes when you follow the letter of the law so strictly with blinders, right? And you don't think about, how do I make everyone happy and settle this case? It led to the Churban Beis HaMikdash, right? So that's something we should all understand. Very interesting. So that's the concept of din, and that's a concept of pshara. Okay, and like I said, the first week of Sanhedrin, the Gemara a few times alludes to this concept of pshara. So now we're going to do what we always do. We're going to look at the Sefer HaChinuch and see how he describes this mitzvah. So if you're following at home, it is mitzvah number 491 in Parshas Shoftim. Limanos Shoftim v'Shotrim. Okay, number 491, I'm reading. Limanos Shoftim v'Shotrim sheyachrichu lasos mitzvahs haTorah. Okay, Shoftim and Shotrim force us to do the mitzvos. The Yachziru Hanotin Miderech Ha'emes Eleha Ba'al Korcha. Okay, and basically to bring those that are kind of going off the derech, okay, back to their proper way. Okay, even if it's against their will. Okay, the Yitzavu Barui Lasos V'Yimnu Hadvarim Hamugunan, and what this basically does is it's in order to correct what's wrong and to prevent bad things. Okay, and V'Kaimu Hagdarim Al Ha'over Ad Shalo Yihiyu Mitzvos HaTorah Min Yoseh Tzvichos Le'emunas Kol Ish V'ish. Basically, so we're trying to do this so people actually keep the commandments and people don't say, oh, I'll accept whatever I want. Right? There has to be some kind of system. There has to be some kind of rule book that people follow. Umitanai ha-mitzvah hazot shiyu elu hadayanim madrega elyona mi madrega. Okay, so he says, and that now we're going to talk a little bit about the judges, that each judges should be one level above the other. What does that mean? That the basic Sanhedrin, we're going to see obviously in the beginning, where there's three types. There's 3, there's 23, and then there's 71. So the Esrim, the Shlosha, gets in each city. Okay? That is called Sanhedrin Kitana. ונעמיד בירושלים בית גדול מ70 דיינים, ונעמיד אחד על 7 מהם והוא נקרא ראש הישיבה. Right, you heard the expression Rosh HaYeshiva? This is where it comes from. The way the Chinuch describes the 71, which is the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, right? That is 70 plus 1 Rosh Yeshiva. That's what he calls the guy, the one in charge of the Rosh Yeshiva. That is the Nasi, Kumoken. That is what he calls the Nasi. That's a synonym for Rosh Yeshiva. And they have to be in one particular place. And a place where there's no 23, if it's a small town where you want to have something on the side, then you could have one that's made up of 3. Right? And that's why we say Dine Mamanos Bishlosha. That's how we start off by saying, because 3 is the minimum. And the difficult matters go to the one that's above 3. Now it gets a little controversial because he's going to talk about the Shotrim. Okay, you have to appoint Nogsim, which are basically people who oppress, right? Policemen in the street. Yabitu inyani b'neyada b'schars mimkarnu mimkachan ad shelo yiheh b'neihem ha'avel. This is security guards, what we would call, right? Who patrol that there shouldn't be any crime, any theft. Va'afilu b'davar mu'at v'hamitzvah sheba hazeh hu amar yitbarach shoftim b'shotrim titen lacha. Okay, so that's an introduction to the basics, and then he talks about in the next paragraph. We'll skip to the next paragraph. Shorish HaMitzvah. What's the root of this commandment? We always know once he gives an introduction, right? There's always something more to be said. So the root, niglahu, she'im hadavar hazeh na'amid datenu bihios emas alufenu v'shoftenu al pnei ha'hamon. Right? The root is that this is something that na'amid datenu, it supports our religion. Okay? In that the ema, the fear of our judges and our officers will be al pnei ha'hamon, will be on the people. Like when you're driving and you see a police car, right? What's the first thing you do? You make sure your seatbelt is on. You make sure your phone is in the cup holder, and that you're not going, and that you're not speeding. If it weren't for policemen on the road, people would do whatever they want. So just the presence of officers gives us a little bit of, Yira Shemayim, to stick to the laws. Umitoch hergelam betov v'biyosher machmas yira yolamdu ha'am tivam lasos mishpat v'tzedek me'ahava. And when we actually are getting used to doing yasher and tov, not because we necessarily want to, but because we're scared, so the people will, do justice out of love and recognize the derech ha'emes. Uki'inyan sheyomer hachachamim sharov ha'hergel huma she'achar hateva. Okay, so this is a very, very interesting line that he uses sometimes, which basically says that hergel is a way of saying habit. He says that really that our habit is what is behind nature, meaning we are accustomed to something based on what we see. So, klomar ki kamosha hateva yachriach ha'adam lema shehu mevakesh, just like teva, right? Meaning that to say, right, he's comparing it, just like nature is how should we say, constrains a person to what he wants, so too can a hergel hagadol chozer bo ke'ein teva. So too that habits that go and repeat itself, so that always makes him and he gets this persistent nature that he's always going to go in the way of his habit. So if he sees something and he gets used to it, he'll say, oh, okay, I know to behave today because the police are out. And over time, people are going to behave even if the police aren't out, right? It's like these experiments they do with animals. After a while, you habituate to something, and that's kind of what he's saying over here. So that's why he's talking about teva, a very interesting philosophical way of looking at this, about why have shotrim, why have these, why have this system. So and if people go in the path of just and faith, and they choose good, then tov yidbak behen, then tov, good, will cling to them, and God will rejoice v'yismach Hashem b'maisav. Everything is great in the world. So it's a very lovely way of describing the reasons why we have to have some kind of law and order, so that it kind of affects our mentality, how we think. And once we think, it becomes like our nature to just be good and people who behave. Beautiful. Okay, so that is the explanation of the Sefer HaChinuch. So that's really the first part I wanted to talk about, is appointing the judges and this Gemara in Sanhedrin. We saw again, there's hours and hours of things we could talk about. I just wanted to select just a few things. I wanted to now go and segue to the other main discussion about the whole Sanhedrin, which is this concept of rove. So to introduce, before we get to the psukim, I wanted to introduce this by quoting a Yerushalmi. Okay, the Yerushalmi is in the fourth parak of Sanhedrin. Amar Rabbi Yanai, ilu nitna haTorah chatucha lo haisa l'regel amida. Okay, so the Yerushalmi says that Rabbi Yanai says, if the Torah had just been given chatucha, so the word chatucha is literally means cut, but it means like decisive, already decided, or as we would say today, black and white, right? There's nothing to debate. This is the law, right? You have to stick to it. Lo haisa l'regel amida, right? This is the it's kind of like the debate, the strike zone. That's what I was thinking about. That, the beauty of a strike zone is that each umpire has a different strike zone, and there's no real balls and strikes. It's a lot of times it's relative to way this umpire views it, and the pitcher over the game has to kind of get used to it. Now that they're talking about having it robotic and take away the umpire to make it perfect, on the one hand, it's great, but it's just black and white. There's no gray anymore. So the old timers, may not like it because it's too perfect. You always want some kind of, variation between umpires. So this is what the Yerushalmi, I think, is saying the same thing, that if we just had a decided law and there's no debate, there's no discussion, this is it, lo haisa l'regel amida, which literally means no foot could stand. My time, what's the reason? So it quotes a pasuk, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Okay, that's what the Yerushalmi says, because it says 100 times in the Torah, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So what does that mean? Amar lefanav. Moshe said, Ribono shel olam, hodiene he'echi halacha. Okay, please tell me, what is the halacha? What do you mean, what's the halacha? So the way the commentators on this Yerushalmi explain is that each and every commandment, not each and every one, but a lot of times in the Torah, we will start off a halacha by saying Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Right? We have it dozens and dozens of times. So the preamble was Hashem telling Moshe. Okay, what would he say? So he would say, lemor, that this is what to say to the Jewish people. Okay? But Moshe says, just give me the bottom line. God is saying, lemor. Now, what does lemor mean? Lemor, the way the Medrash explains lemor, is that shebachol dibur haya omer panim lakan ulakan. Meaning, it wasn't a clear-cut halacha. Moshe, the way the Yerushalmi explains, says, just tell me the bottom line, give me the halacha. God says, no, lemor. So Moshe says, Hodiani he'echi halacha, just tell me what the halacha is. Amar lo achar rabim lahatos. So God answers him, I can't tell you what the halacha is. I could tell you generally the way it usually works in this specific law, but at the end of the day, achre rabim lahatos, the majority rule. Meaning, Rabu hamazikin zachu, Rabu hamachayvin chivu. If you have a majority, i.e. chachamim, opining one way, we hold like that. If they say you're zoche, right? If you say that you're innocent, you're innocent. But if a majority say you're chayav, then you're chayav. So God says to Moshe, I can't tell you what the halacha is going to be all the time, because we don't know what's going to arise, right? So therefore, we have to leave it up to the people of that generation to figure out. Again, Moshe wanted a clear-cut answer. God says, I can't do that, right? It's not chatucha. This isn't clear-cut, 100% decisive. Each instance has to be judged by itself. Okay? Memtes nidresh kadesh Torah nidreshes memtes panim tameh umemtes panim tahor. There's 49 times, or there's 49 ways. Is that right? There's 98 ways to skin a cat. 49 times you could go for tameh. 49 times it could be tahor, right? Where does number 49 come from? Minayin v'diglu. So the Yerushalmi gives a gematria from the word v'daglu. V'chenu omer amros Hashem amros tahoros kesef tzara ba'alila eretz mezugak shivasayim. Okay, whatever it is, we have a nice asmachta that says 7 sevens, and we have 49. There's 49 ways of saying this, and there's 49 ways of saying that. Parenthetically, if you remember, I think the Gemara in Eruvin says that Rav Meir was so charif. One of the reasons why we don't hold like Rav Meir was because he could give you 49 reasons why a sheretz is tameh and 49 reasons why a sheretz is tahor. I think this is where it came from. right? There's different ways of looking at instances. And the first thing that I was that struck me from this, it for example, is if you remember in the beginning of Psachim, we had that famous Gemara, which is called the Shnei Shvilin Gemara. Right? Remember the setup? A person goes on a road, and there's two roads to go somewhere. One of the roads, there was Tuma, and one of the roads was Tameh, and he doesn't know which road he went on. Right? This isn't a riddle. Right? This is actually a case. So he goes to the rabbi, and we have this concept that if you're Safek Tuma Birshus Harabim, you are Tahor. So he says, you're Tahor. Then an hour later, someone else comes. Okay. And he says, I walked on one of the two paths. I don't know which one I walked on. So the rabbi says, 50-50, we're going to call you Tahor. But the punchline of the Gemara is, what if they both come at the same time? If they both come at the same time, then we have a big problem, because you can't say that both of them are Tahor, because one definitely went on the Tameh road. Right? Again, if there's only two roads and one is definitely Tameh and one is definitely Tahor, and they both walked at the same time next to each other, seeing each other, so one of them is definitely Tameh. So that's an example of looking at something by itself, and this is a very deep concept. And there are a lot of different examples. You could have a whole shiur just on this one. It's a very big Rav Soloveitchik, has a lot of depth.
Tzale,
Yes.
they each walked on different roads, not the same road.
No, correct. But one of those two roads was Tameh, because there's only two ways to get somewhere.
Right, but they each walked. They didn't walk together. He said that they walked together. They walked separately on different roads.
Right, but they came together.
Yeah.
The point is that they came.
Yeah, they came together, but they didn't walk together.
Correct. So because they came together, we have a problem.
This
it's
is
like a tarte de sasre, where we can't say, oh, well, you are Safek Toma, you are Safek Tahor, and you are Safek Tahor, because it's a contradiction.
But this is like the case where he has the three pieces of meat. One of them is non-kosher.
Right.
And he eats all three.
He eats all three.
No,
right.
First he eats the first two, he's okay. And then the third one he could eat also, because he already ate the non-kosher.
Because he already, right. And that's the whole discussion about batel, not to get into that now, but how do you deal with a case of batel b'shishim, right? There's a machokas rishonim. Are you allowed to eat one? Are you allowed to eat all 60? If you definitely know one of them is. So one of the common, so one opinion is you throw one out and you say that's the one that's not kosher. Or if you eat each one individually, so each one individually has a 2% chance that that's the one that's not kosher. So that's basically what I'm trying to get at about what this whole discussion between God and Moshe was that Moshe said, I want a bottom line, and God said, no, Lamor, we have to figure this out, and we have to go achrei rabim lahatos. So that's how I wanted to at least introduce this discussion about, it's not so, as they say, it's not so pashut. Nothing is ever so pashut, especially when we don't know what kind of laws come up, or we don't know what kind of circumstances come up. That's why everything has to be looked at by itself with a bezdin of 73, of 71 or 23, whatever it is. You need some kind of clarity, and the clarity doesn't come from a Ring video, okay? It comes from a majority rule. Okay, so that's what I wanted to discuss. So the source for this concept, and again, we've spent many days on this, one way or another, and all the bavas, not all the bavas are finished, over the last year and a half. The pasuk is, I'm going to read from 23:2. Okay, in Shmos, Losia achre rabim laraos, velosana al rivlintos, achre rabim lahatos. It happens to be a very, very complicated pasuk because there's many interpretations of what the first two things mean of Losia achre rabim laraos. Basically means that you can't go on the side that convicts. You can't win by one. It's like if you remember in ping pong, right? I think you have to win by two. So that's how it works when you convict. It has to be 13 to 10. It can't be 12 to 11. That doesn't work. It has to be 13 to 10 when you convict. When you exonerate someone, it's fine, but you have to win by two when you convict. Losana el rivlintos. We're not going to talk about that now. But the bottom line, it says achre rabim lahatos. So there's a beautiful Chassam Sofer that he quotes, and it's attributed to a lot of different people. I know it was attributed to Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz at one point. He asks a philosophical question that I'm sure you all heard of, but if you want to know where it is inside, if it ever comes up, you should know that the Chassam Sofer quotes this in right on the pasuk. Yesh lefarish al pi ma shesha'al echad me'umas ha'olam. Right, a non-Jew or an agnostic asks, "Ksiv b'toraschem acher rabim lahatos." You go after the majority. V'rov ovdei avodah zarah hema. Right, if you look at the world's religions, right, it is overwhelmingly ovdei avodah zarah, or in our purposes, we'll call it non-Jewish. Right, we make up 1.5% of the world, something like that. So how come you don't say Acher Rabim Lahatos when it comes to the religions of the world? Why don't we succumb to the majority when it comes to the religions? So the Chassam Sofer answers. He says the whole discussion about following the rove is where you enter you're in a fight and you're in some kind of contention, and I could see your side and there's a big debate, right? I could see your side, I could see this side. Then Azlinan Basa Rov. So what do? We follow, right? We follow the majority. If there's something as clear as day, afilu alfe alafim omrim neged habarer. V'yadu alanu. If you have 1 million people line up and tell you today is not Tuesday, and you are so sure it's Tuesday because your calendar says it's Tuesday, your iPhone says it's Tuesday, you said Shir Shel Yom HaShlishi, that's how you know it's Tuesday. If you have millions of people telling you it's not Tuesday today, then does that mean you have to follow the rove? No. Because it's so borur that Shashem Elokeinu Hu Elokim Emes V'Toraso Emes Al Pima Shebinyanu Ra'inu V'Kabalnu B'Sinai. Right? What our eyes saw in Har Sinai, we know to us it's so clear. As ein shayach leilech basarov. Wow. Yeah, if you have a debate and you could see both sides, then rov is a birur. Rov clarifies the ambiguous situation. Masha ein kein b'davar barer. Now, obviously, we're very partial because we believe what we believe. I'd like to think that. And to us, it's a no-brainer. But if you don't think it's a no-brainer, then you're back to the question of the Chassam Sofer. So there's a lot to be said on that. I want to skip, I just wanted to throw that out. But so that's the Chassam Sofer. There is another, we're going to do our second Nitziv of the day. The Nitziv deals with a very simple question: why do we follow the majority? So if you ask the average person, they'll say, "Well, it's logic, right? The majority is just logic." Look at the words of the Nitziv. I'm reading from the Hemak Davar. He says, "Acher Rabim Lahatos Yesh Leilech Acharei Das Rabim Shemistama." Kadeos harabim hu hatov v'hayashar. I don't know what that means. V'zehu pashta dahaikra. He says pashut pshat is that majority is tov v'yashar, meaning the majority of the opinion is tov and yashar. Okay, so I was just looking in the world of philosophy, and I came across Henry David Thoreau. We all know him as an author, but he actually wrote a book in 1849 called Civil Disobedience. He was a peacenik back in the day. He protested slavery, protested the Mexican War, but he wrote a whole book called Civil Disobedience, and he dealt with the question. It's interesting. It's still, Bisman Hazeh, basically how people should deal with government policies that they believe to be immoral, right? So he goes through a whole, again, not to go into detail, there's just a little bit where he talks about the majority, because rules are passed in government, and majority obviously forms a lot of the opinion of the government. And here he says, I'm quoting from him, he says, after all, the practical reason why, when the power is once in the hands of the people, a majority are permitted for a long period continue to rule is not because they are most likely to be in the right, nor because this seems fairest to the minority. So he's saying, what's the reason why we follow the majority? It's not because they're likely right, all right, or because this seems fairest to the minority, but because they are physically the strongest. So he actually attributes it to brute strength, meaning more people are going to be stronger than less people. I didn't do major analysis on this, but I thought, wow, that's not exactly the way the Netziv explains it. But nevertheless, you have one man's opinion. So I always like throwing out some potpourri on varying opinions. So we have the Netziv, we have Thoreau, why he thinks the majority rules. But let's get back to the most important opinion, and that always resides in the words of the Sefer HaChinuch. Because in mitzvah number 78, that I'm about to open, this is a very, very beautiful explanation of Rov from the words of the Chinuch. He says, number 78, okay, mitzvah hataya acharei rabim. Lintos acharei rabim, to always follow the majority. V'hu kishayipol machlokas ben hachachamim bedin. Midine haTorah kula, when there's a machlokas in any Torah matter. Ukumoken bedine prati, or in any individual case. Not just a halacha case, but Reuven and Shimon, like we see every day in Daf Yomi. Klomar, bedin sheyeh ben Reuven v'Shimon, al derech mashal. Kishitiyeh machlokas ben dayana iram shektasam danim chiyuv, uktatam liptor, lintos achar harov la'olam. We always follow the majority opinion. Shenemar achar rabim lahatos, ubebir amru zichrono bracha, and we say in the Gemara in Chulin, a very, very famous Gemara, Ruba de Oraisa. That's a whole shir within itself. Daf Yud Aleph in Chulin, it's famous because it talks about the concept of Chazaka being a D'Oraisa and Ruba being a D'Oraisa. Now, the Gemara actually says, how do we know Ruba is D'Oraisa? And the Gemara says, what do you mean, how do we know? Because it says. So then the Gemara goes into different kinds of rovs. We're not going to talk about that in the 11 minutes we have left, but I just want to read on. Ubechiras rov zeh lefi hadomehu shevish shtei hakitos acholkes yodos b'chachma haTorah b'shava. Right? So he says that the choosing the majority is when you have two different groups, okay, that are equal, or as the expression is, they're on the same playing field, they're in the same league, whatever expression you want to use, right? They are equal. She'ein lomar shakat chacham muetes, lo tachriya kat burim meruba v'afilu kiyotzi mitzrayim. Don't tell me that if you have 3 rabbis versus 5,000 commoners, that if 5,000 commoners decide to do it one way, that they're the rove. That's not how it works. And this is a very, very important point. You have to be in the same equal playing field, right? So in this case, in this example, right, a couple of people who are in the know, who are ordained, they will actually outweigh a bunch of boors, okay, even if there's hundreds of thousands of them. But when everything is an equal playing field, right? The Torah is telling us that a majority will tend to get it right, right, closer to the emes more than the minority. And that's kind of like this Ruba de Lesa Kaman that I didn't want to start talking about, but it's what we would call a statistical rove. Like most people do X. Most women give birth at 9 months. Most whatever rove you want to use, right? The Gemara goes through a lot of statistical roves. So also when it comes to people, more people side on one side will statistically say that chances are that this person is guilty or innocent. So therefore, hodiatanu atorah sheriboy hadayas yaskimu la'olam el ha'emes yoser min hamiut uben sheyaskimu la'emes olo, and whether or not they agree to the emes olo yaskimu lefi das hashomea hadin nosen shelo nasur miderech harov, right? Whether or not it's the truth in the end. That, because sometimes you could get it wrong, but that's the only thing we have to go on, right? And that'll get us to the derech emes. Ki ken nemar b'chol makom chutz min Sanhedrin. Because we say that the majority is always, right, when we have these two groups, right? Again, we have two groups and they disagree. Okay, so again, we said that they have to be equal in wisdom. That's except for the Sanhedrin. What does that mean? So he goes on to explain, Shebehen lo nedaktek bihiyosan cholkin ezek kas yodas yoser, elo la'olam nasa kedivri harov mehen. Everyone in the Sanhedrin, if you made it to the Sanhedrin, then you're all in the same league. Okay, so we're not going to say, oh, well, look at this judge and look at that judge and look at that judge, and like we do today with the Supreme Court, where we know 9 of them, 4 or 5 are conservative and 4 are liberal, and they each have their own, like, batting average. And after a big case, they'll say, oh, well, we know how this person is greater in this person's greater in that. They all have their pluses and minuses. That's not true with the Sanhedrin. Okay, meaning that when they disagree, we don't really care, right? We go by the majority, and we don't look at their average. Okay, so that's very, very important. V'hatam lefi shehen hayu b'cheshbon mechuyev min haTorah v'hu ki'ilu tzivta haTorah b'feirosh acharov shel elu ta'asu kol inyanchem v'od shehem kulam hayu chachamim gedolim. Like we said, they're all great sages, and that's the reason. Is because as long as you have the number of people, so you just follow the rove. There's a very interesting Gemara. I just want to open up in Bava Kama Daf Chav Zayin. Okay, the Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Chav Zayin has a concept, and we also had it in Bava Basra. The reason why I'm quoting it from Bava Kama is because there's a very, very famous Tosfos that deals with this question of Holchen b'mammon achar harov. Right? We know that rove gets us everywhere, right? However, when it comes to mammon, there are certain times where we don't follow, right? Where we don't follow mammon achar harov, which is what? If you remember, so in Bava Basra, we had it in a case where a person sells an ox and he turns out to gore, and we'd say, oh, well, why don't we just look at, how many people buy oxes to plow and how many people buy oxes just to eat, and they don't care if it gores. And the Gemara goes through a whole thing. And the Gemara also in Daf Chav Zayin talks about someone who buys a cod and someone buys a chavis. Right, we're doing Chazara from like a year and a half ago. I hope you remember. Right, and then we say, well, do they call it a cod? Do they call it a chavis? And we say we don't really care, because I would have thought that you go after the majority of people in that place. What do they call it? So the Gemara says, no, I don't care, because when it comes to mammon, right, where we have a suffix, okay, and I don't know if this is a cod or if this is a chavis, or do I refund your money because the shore that I sold you was a wild shore, right? We don't say, well, most people plow. We don't care what most people do. So what do we care about? We care about who the mochzik is, and then we say Hamotzi Mechavel of Haraya. So that's the Gemara. So it's a very, very famous Tosfos, and I'm saying it for one specific thing, which is Tosfos says, why don't we just learn a Kal V'chomer from Dinei Nefashos? Dinei Nefashos, we go after Rov. If you have what? 23 and 13 people say kill him, and 10 people say don't kill him, or if it's 71, right? Let's say if it's let's say 40 to 31, say kill him. So we go after, right? So if we go after Rov and Dinei Nefashos, which is Chamor, so certainly we should go after Rov when it comes to Dinei Mamonos. Okay? And Tosfos answers, V'yesh lomar dahasam gabe dayanim shiny. When it comes to judges, it's different. There's no Rov when it comes to judges. What does that mean? When it comes to monetary judges, the chashiv miut ditu kumoshe eno. Because the miut, the minority, doesn't exist. And the way it's explained that there is no Rov and there is no miut when it comes to judges, because if there's a case, let's say, going back to 23, 13 say he's chayav, 10 say he's pater, right? Or 13 say he's pater, 10 say he's chayav. So the guy wins the case 13 to 10. So do we analyze it and say, well, he was close? Or do we say, no, we don't care if it's 13. It's not like in football where it matters how many points you score if there's a tiebreaker, right, in the playoffs, or, right, it doesn't really matter when it comes to Sanhedrin. Because if you lose by 3, it doesn't matter if you lose by 3, or it doesn't matter if you lose by 10, right? Sports, it does, either for betting purposes, for the line, or for other things that we mentioned. But when it comes to the Sanhedrin, it doesn't really care, because it's as good as a shutout. Why? Because Sanhedrin is different, because we view it as one unit. And when you lose the case because there weren't enough people on your side, there's no Rov. That's why Ein Holchem B'Mamon Achar HaRov. That's a very, very important, and it's funny, it goes back a little bit to this whole thing, how we look at, breaking it into pieces or looking at the whole picture. We look at the whole picture when it comes to, it's like one big unit. And therefore the miut doesn't exist anymore. It's like batal b'shishim. It disintegrated. There is nothing left of the yisser, right? It's all batal. So too over here, this miut, this minority, doesn't exist when it comes to dinei mamonos. I want to just conclude in the minute we have left with a beautiful Pele Yoetz I saw. We quote him once in a blue moon, which is basically, the Pele Yoetz was a Moroccan Kabbalist, and he put together a book. It's almost like a Shulchan Aruch with a lot of Musar. Like, you would definitely classify this as a Musar Sefer. And I just want to read it because it's very Lamaisa. It's very in the news, that we're all, especially with what's going on in Israel in the last year or so, we've all been transformed. And the topic of chapter 15 in the Pele Yoetz is on Achdus. So if you ever wanted a beautiful shmooze on the importance of Achdut, or as they say in Yeshiva, Achdus, here it is. I'm going to read it from the Pele Yoetz. Achdus hi amod gedola letikun olam ulakayim kol davar. V'ruach hamakom nochem ma'od midavar zeh. God loves, enjoys nothing more when his children are in achdus. Ad she'amru rabbeinu ala pasuk, he quotes a pasuk in Iyov, v'hu be'echad, echad lo namer ela be'echad. She'ein hashchina shor b'Yisrael ela kishehem be'achdus. Ugdul mizu amru ala pasuk in Hosea, chabur atzabim Ephraim hanachlo. This is a pasuk we all, and I think I've used this twice already in the 4 years of doing this. Sha'afilu im ovdem avodah zara. He says, I don't care. And this is a pasuk from Hosea 4. It's in one of the Haftorahs. I think this might have been Vayetze or a few weeks ago. Sha'afilu im ovdem avodah zara kishen ba'achdos ein midas hedin yuchal lishlot behen. Right, the Medrash, the Tanchuma says that whatever we do in achdus, we're untouchable, even if it's avodah zara. And that's the secret, by the way, in case you were wondering why people ask, wasn't the Dor HaFlaga just as bad as the Dor HaMabul? Yet we weren't destroyed. We just got, we added a few more languages. But we weren't destroyed. And the answer is Lefi Shahaya Ba'achtus. V'zeh etzli pashut had kasav hen echad am hen am echad b'safa achas l'kulam. V'ata kivin shehen ba'achtus lo yivatzer mehen kol asher yazum ulasos. This is a quote. Okay. Next. V'chol chabura sherotzum lasos davar v'shiel lokiyam v'hamada. Okay, he's giving us advice. Sorry, I'm running a couple minutes late, but I think this is very worthwhile. Any group that wants to do something that will have kiyum, that will have fulfillment and perpetuity. Perpetuity. Tzarech sheyeh kulam b'agud achas. Do it in one bundle, in one unit. V'az kol ruchas sheba'olam ein mazizan oso mimkomon. Avolim zeh omer bako. Zeh omer bako v'chol echad rotza b'dibur yel lefanim v'ol achor v'omed didan netzach. I'm the right one. Hem nasim agudos. Then you have the problem of agudos, various factions. V'nafak churba v'hilo titzlach. Okay, I'm going to skip to the third, which is Nogea us. The Hageder Hagadol Kedelios Ba'achtos Hu Sheyakayim Sha'amra Torah Achar Rabam Lahatos. So he's giving us alamilas of Achtos, but he says, bottom line is, how do you achieve this? How do you How are you Makayim it? He says, you're Makayim it by Achar Rabam Lahatos. The Asim Nira Bara Be'enav Shehem Toim. The Elav Roi L'Shamea Shehu Omer Hagun Davar Hagun. Yivatel Daito Negedatam. Even if you think, or even if you see clearly that there's a mistake, you still have to listen. V'asiya Gamhu Im Harabim V'lo Yavor Al Das Chavero. This is a bomb of a chiddush, she's saying. He's saying, even if there's a mistake, kind of like Avodah Zarah, but if you do it, if you know that you're right, but you're outvoted, then there's nothing you could do. You have to be mevatel your das to the das of the majority. And he quotes a Gemara. This is a fascinating Gemara. Kamam Rabbi Yossi Shamar. Here, listen to what Rabbi Yossi says in Masechah Shabbos Tav Kuf Yuches. Ma'olam lo avarti al das chaveri. If my friends told me to do something against what I thought, I never ever ignored them. Yodea ba'ani, and this is a very controversial thing he's going to say, and you could have a whole shiur just on this line. In fact, I spoke about this once a long time ago, not for now, but he says, Yodea ani ba'atzmi she'eni kohen. Rav Yossi says, I know that I am not a kohen, for sure. But if my friends told me, you are a kohen, and you have to go up to Duchen, I would listen to them. There's a Tosfos, I think, on that Gemara that discusses what this really means. It's a little complicated Gemara, but we see, at least in the Pashut Pshat, that you have to be mevatel yourself to what other people tell you, even if you think, or even if you know, that's the key word, even if you know that you're right, you have to cede. And can you imagine if this was in the news today, if people actually listen to this? All of our, okay, no editorial necessary. V'im hayu omer michaveru ala laduchan haiti ola v'gam hu yatsa likras neshek neged achokim min harabim v'yomer alehem b'noam siach shelehem roy lishma af she'ein datem muskemes imam, even if you don't agree. Ulifamim, and he ends off by saying tzarich shazikenim v'agdolim yishmu lekatanim, the elders have to listen to the youngsters. If yivatlu ritzonam ipnei ritzonam lefi tzarich shak sharon shekar v'latzeis pirtz lefi datem shel bachuran. And then he quotes about, which is the whole concept of parhelm davar shel tzibur, right? You have to listen, and because it's the Sanhedrin at the end that really that they are machria because they are the rove. So you see over here in a halachic sense, you see over here a little hashkafa of how to cede to the majority opinion. All right.